So, in this talk, I'm going to walk through what it is to develop an inclusive mindset in the way that you approach product design, and specifically how it relates to iOS app development. I'm going to talk about my own journey here, my evolving and expanding view on what it is to make my apps more inclusive, to expand their usefulness to as many people as possible and to in many different ways. Initially, I would say my view on this, on accessibility, was focused on the standard system features, on things like dynamic type and voiceover. And once I checked off those boxes, everything was good to go. But increasingly, I have a broader view that I feel like has made my apps much better and more useful and helpful to more people. So who am I? My name is David Smith. I'm the maker of apps like WidgetSmith, Pedometer++, and Sleep++. I've been an indie app developer since 2008, since essentially the very beginning of the App Store. I've been doing this a long time, and as such, I've made a lot of mistakes, and hopefully I can share those learnings that I've had over those years to prevent other people from making the same ones as I have. My initial view on accessibility, and I think this is a very natural place to start, was to think of accessibility was all about compensating for a user's physical limitations. To think of things in terms of maybe the system features that if you open the iOS settings app and go to the accessibility section, you'll see a list of features, and most of these tend to associate with a particular physical limitation. So as a result, the accessibility parts of my app would tend to be oriented around those features. That, for example, if a user had limited vision, maybe I would work on dynamic type or voiceover to accommodate for that limitation. But I think the really key thing, and this is something that took a long time to become a really core part of my design philosophy, is that every ability and every dimension exists along a spectrum. So whether we're talking about a user who has limited vision, that could mean any number of things, from having no vision at all, to having issues with color, with acuity, with the size of elements. There are so many different forms that this could take. And so I think one of my earlier mistakes was only focusing on the ends of that spectrum. I would build an accommodation for something on the end of a spectrum, but kind of neglect the entire middle in between. And so if your ability wasn't on either end of the spectrum, you were not being given an optimal experience. It was also very limiting because our ability to use software is not governed solely by our physical capabilities. There are so many other aspects of our life and abilities, life experience, personal experience, that go into our ability to use a software. And so if I was only focused on physical limitations, on physical accommodations, I was limiting the ability of my application to be used by so many people in so many ways. And so increasingly, I find that I don't really like using the word accessibility in my own design work. Instead, I now think more in the sense of inclusiveness or user comfort. How can I design my application to be as inclusive as possible? How can I make my app more comfortable to be used by more people? Rather than focusing only on those ends, I can focus on the entire number line and make an app that is useful to the maximum number of people in the maximum possible ways. I'm trying to expand out the surface area of usability for where my app is useful, where it can be used by many different people in many different ways. And this allows it to be more inclusive, and it applies to so many different parts of my application beyond the original view. Because the main truth of once you wrap your head around this idea, and this is mainly the reason why I wanted to do this talk, is that there's so many different ways that your app could be made more inclusive. Areas that you may have never thought of could be made more inclusive. This is beyond the typical, what you would think of as accessibility features. This is an inclusive mindset. This is a different way of thinking about your app design that is very holistic and very considerate of every part of your application and the user experience. And so to illustrate this, I'm going to walk through some of the learnings I've had in the process of designing and working on Pedometer++, which is a step counting app that I wrote for iOS and watchOS. I originally wrote this application in 2013, so it's been around for a very long time. And as a result, I've made a lot of mistakes in its development, and I've learned a lot of things. And I think a lot of those improvements are things that are great examples of a kind of inclusive, holistic view on product design. I'm going to start off by talking about the more straightforward examples. These are the table stakes things that you absolutely should be doing and are hallmarks of any inclusive application. For example, your app should absolutely support dynamic type. In Pedometer++, if you increase the dynamic type size, everything will get bigger. And I do this, and it's a very useful and perhaps one of the most common accommodations and affordances that people look for in an application. And it's an excellent example of an ability that exists on a spectrum. And the great thing about dynamic type is that the user can choose exactly where on that spectrum they are most comfortable. If they want things to be very small, they can make them very small. If they want them to be very big, they can make them very big. And so by Pedometer++ supporting a wide range of different settings and abilities there, I can make a wide range of users very comfortable. Another obvious example is something like VoiceOver, which is a system that's designed to make it possible for users to use your application who can't necessarily see it or have difficulty navigating by tapping in the traditional way. And in this example screenshot I have here, I've made the screen completely blank. And this is just a little side note, a little pro tip, if you will, that if you're going to be working on VoiceOver, I highly recommend that you use the screen curtain functionality, which is when VoiceOver is on, if you triple tap the screen with 3 fingers, the screen will go completely blank. Now you should try and use your application with a completely blank screen and get a sense of the experience of what a user might have who had very limited vision. And as a little bonus side tip on top of this, be aware that if you can turn VoiceOver on and off using Siri. So if you just activate Siri and say VoiceOver on or VoiceOver off, it'll turn on or off, which is super helpful because if you have screen curtain on and you've gotten lost because your design wasn't exactly as easy and intuitive as you would have hoped, you can just turn it off, fix the design, and then try again. Another form of fairly straightforward inclusiveness is localization. This is coming from the understanding that many of the people who want to use your application come from different backgrounds, different cultures, speak different languages, and the degree to which I can localize my application is another form of inclusiveness, a way of making it feel more useful and making more users feel more comfortable. It isn't necessarily something that often we think about in terms of accessibility, but localizing Pedometer++ into a variety of different languages and regions is something that has really helped the app to be more useful to more people. And as a business owner, that has also been something that's been really helpful because more people want and are able to use my app. So those are some of the straightforward and obvious places to start with. But now I'm going to kind of get a bit more subtle and creative and talk through some of the other ideas and things that I've learned from working on Pedometer++ for so long. And these are areas where I feel like I've learned a lot on how I can expand and make the app so much more inclusive. The first place is probably a very simple one, but something that I ran into when I was redesigning Pedometer++ recently. And this is the design of the goal stepper, a simple control in the app that lets you choose whatever your daily step goal should be. And initially when I was designing this, I had made the button for decreasing your goal red and the button for increasing your goal green. But then the more I thought about that, the more I realized that what I was doing, and that was somewhat inherent in this design, is that I was indicating to the user that a higher goal is good and a lower goal is bad. That this design had a subtle subtext lurking deep inside of it that I really didn't want to have there. I want to make a user feel comfortable adjusting their goal to fit their current situation, whatever that might be. If they're sick or they fall down and they hurt their leg, they should be lowering their goal, and that is completely appropriate and excellent and awesome and something that they should be doing. So I shouldn't be designing something in a way that creates this negative connotation on lowering their goal. So instead, I made the app look like this, where both the increase and decrease buttons are green, just different colors, so there's still some contrast. But now there's no judgment inherent in this design. There's nothing in this design that is telling you that one of those buttons is better than the other. And I think it's a really helpful example of something where I would have users who would contact me and say they were frustrated that they couldn't maintain their 10,000 step goal because they got sick or because something happened in their life. And now I feel like, the app is trying to tell you that's fine. You lower your goal. When you feel better, raise it back up again. Make the app be comfortable to whatever your circumstances are. And similarly, it's perhaps interesting to talk about what the increment is between different step goals. So when you push this button, how much should the step goal change? When I had initially built the app, the increment was 500 steps, which seemed like a quick way to easily adjust your goal. And that was the way it was for a while until I heard from some users who were using Pedometer++ in a rehabilitation context. So this is where situations where people had injuries or veterans who had been injured and were relearning to walk. And in this context, 500 steps is just too large of an increment. It's too big of a jump for them to make. And so they were losing out on the ability for the app to give them this positive reinforcement cycle, which could be so motivating. And so now the app has a much smaller step increment. It's typically 100, and then as you get to lower goal values, it drops to 50 steps. And that's much more inclusive and much more useful in some of these really powerful and really awesome contexts. Another area that I had some learning to do was as it related to theme colors. So in the app, since it was very first designed in 2013, there are 3 main UI colors. There's a green, which means that you've met your goal. There's an orange, which means you're above 50% of your goal. And there's red if you're below 50% of your goal, which is kind of coming from the kind of classically Western culture of, green is go, red is stop, and, orange is somewhere in between. But very quickly, I learned that this is not a great theme for many people because for a lot of people, they have challenges differentiating between colors, especially red and green. So instead, I now have 2 different themes in the app. One is the green, orange, and red, and then there's another one that's blue, orange, and red. And so for many people who have issues differentiating between color, this new palette works really well and makes the app work much better for them in a way that they can understand where they are. Another area where I've done a lot of work is on the badge system. So badges are rewards that you can get in the app for doing various things. And each month there's a new badge, a new challenge that you can sort of set for yourself and hope to work towards in a way that is motivating. And something that I found that was super important when working on these monthly challenges is that they are always relative to the user's goal or to their history. I'm not setting a badge goal that is something like, say, walk 20,000 steps in a day, which maybe is a very cool accomplishment and something achievable for many people. But if your daily goal is 2,000 steps, 20,000 just isn't realistic or isn't possible. And if it isn't attainable, it isn't motivating. And so for all of these, I've always made my goals relative. Or similarly, I always start the badges off with something that's very attainable. And these tend to ramp up very quickly and can get very challenging. Earning a 3-year streak in Pedometer++ is very difficult. But the initial goal, the initial badge you can earn is 3 days, and then 7 days, and then 15. And I want there to be a gradual ramp up so that many more people are able to feel motivated and encouraged by this badge. But with that is also just to keep in mind, and this is just something I want to make clear, is that I'm not saying that you should water down your app to simplify everything down to the lowest common denominator. Instead, an inclusive mindset, an inclusive view, it's just trying to encompass the whole spectrum of users in a way that suits them as well as possible. So here's an example of my daily floors badge, where the lowest one is 20 floors and the highest one is 500 floors. And that's a wide range of possible users. I've been a hiker for a long time. I do hike a lot. I've never reached 500 floors. And the whole point is that there's this spectrum of capability, and we want to cater to each part of it along the way, not just boil it down to something super simple and basic. Or another area to consider is how you educate your apps about how to use your app. Trying to educate users and to make them feel safe in using it when they're a brand new user, or if they've been using it for 10 years, I want to make them feel as comfortable as possible. I want them to feel like the app is something that they can develop a mastery of and feel safe in exploring. And so something I tried to in a lot of Pedometer++'s UI is to have lots of explanation text or unambiguous switches or controls or things that are very clear about what's going to happen. So in this example, I have the switch that you can change the distance mode, whether it should do it automatically or based on your stride length. But rather than having an on or off switch, I label each of those two states very clearly, that one is automatic and one is manual, and there's some text explaining what's going to happen. And so if you're a new user, hopefully this is helpful. But even if you're a sophisticated user who's trying to make sure that they're getting the most out of the application, they can make sure that this setting is the way that they want to do it. There's less ambiguity, and there's a greater sense of control and competence that the user can quickly build. Or another kind of way that you could approach making an app more inclusive is to just think about the user's life, I suppose. And so this is an example of a feature in Pedometer++ that allows for rest days. And so this is something where if you have reached your goal for 6 days in a row, you earn kind of a free day that you can use as a rest day while still maintaining your current streak. And this allows the app to be encouraging and motivating, to have people feeling like they have in the sense of the streak that they're building on that is great for their fitness regime. But instead of it being something that is lost by taking any breaks whatsoever, it's accommodating to recovery as a part of a well-balanced fitness regime. And so this is a feature that I think has worked really well to make it applicable to people who are in a variety of different physical circumstances and doing a variety of different fitness regimes while still maintaining the motivating aspect of it. Or here's an example of a situation where I even took the app and kind of moved it beyond what its kind of obvious use case would be. So when Apple added the ability for Apple Watches to measure the number of daily wheelchair pushes that a user had, I made an option in the application that you will use this rather than steps. And the rest of the app works kind of as you would expect, just measuring wheelchair pushes rather than steps. And so now I have this step counting app that you don't even have to take steps in. In some ways, this is the ultimate expression of my desire to cater to the widest possible user base in the widest possible context. I'm not limiting its usefulness to only people who can traditionally take steps. Wherever you are, I'm trying to meet you there and make the app work and be useful to you. Though the key thing in building a feature like this is that it isn't just a token option, that the whole application is reflective of this new mode and this new use case. And so in Pedometer++, when you're in wheelchair mode, lots of the UI changes, the app icon changes. There's a lot of things that I'm trying to do to make sure that the app feels like it was designed for this user, that you aren't using it in a way that it wasn't intended. I want to make you feel as comfortable and at home in the application as I possibly can, regardless of the way in which you choose to use it. So what else? How else could I make Pedometer++ more inclusive? And I don't really know. I've been working on this app for 10 years, and I'm still learning every day. I'm trying to develop an inclusive mindset that will always be aware and look for opportunities. By far the best way I've found to acquire this kind of inclusive mindset is first to care enough to try, to build these features, to experiment, and then to listen to your users. Ask yourself while you're developing, how could I make this more inclusive? But then more importantly, listen to your users. With all of these designs that I've talked through, usually they're coming from or being refined by my experience of listening to users, to hearing how they're feeling limited, how they're being frustrated, how they could feel like the app could be better for them. I incorporate that and we'll work through it. And as I do this, I develop a better mindset and the app gets better, which is better for them, which is better for me, which is better for everyone. Thanks.